Princess Solara stood at the edge of the grand balcony, her eyes staring out across the palace grounds, as the distant echoes of war drums reverberated throughout the Vaerithan capital. The galaxy was at war, and her people, the proud Vaerithans, were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Norek, a race of cold, calculating conquerors, had launched an invasion that seemed unstoppable. Their ships blotted out the skies, their armies tearing through systems with a precision that left entire planets in ruin. And the Vaerithan Empire was next in line. Emperor Talon, her father, had called a council to discuss their response. The usual suspects had all gathered in the vast council chamber. Generals, strategists, and diplomats from across the empire. But for all their wisdom and experience, Solara had seen little hope in their faces. The Norek were too powerful, too ruthless. She had no doubt her father's intentions were well-meaning, but she feared they were about to make a desperate decision. As the meeting progressed, Solara's thoughts wandered back to a time when she had dreamed of peace, when the most troubling decision of her life had been which gala dress to wear, or whether to spend the afternoon at the palace gardens or with friends in the capital's market. That world felt so far away now. The empire was teetering on the brink of destruction, and her father's empire was counting on her to step up, as the heir, to help guide them through this dark time. "Your Majesty," came a voice from across the room, breaking through her reverie. Solara's gaze snapped back to the table. Her father, the Emperor, had risen to his feet, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice, strong and commanding, echoed through the room. "I have made a decision." The murmurs of the council faded as the room fell into a tense silence. "The situation is dire," he continued, "and we must act swiftly. We need a commander, someone capable of turning the tide. And I have already chosen him." Solara's heart skipped a beat. Her father's words were final, his tone unyielding. She had been bracing herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. "I have selected a human," the Emperor declared, his eyes scanning the room with authority. Ethan Drake. A hushed murmur spread through the room. Humans. They were a relatively young species in the galaxy, and while they had made impressive advances in technology and warfare, they were still seen as outsiders, primitive in many ways, lacking the sophistication of established empires. The Vaerithans, for all their grandeur, had always looked down on humans. They were fierce warriors, yes, but they lacked the ancient traditions and the refinement that the Vaerithan Empire held dear. Solara's stomach churned. Ethan Drake? She had heard of him. The human soldier had earned a reputation across the galaxy for his unorthodox methods. He was a master tactician. But more than that, he was a man who had fought in countless battles, gaining respect through sheer force of will. He was unpredictable, often defying orders and challenging authority at every turn. Many saw him as a loose cannon, and that was precisely the kind of person Solara feared. She stood up, unable to hold back the confusion and panic that bubbled inside her. "Father, are you certain?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and fear. "There must be someone else. Anyone else. A human, leading our forces? We cannot risk everything on him." Her father's gaze softened for just a moment, but the steel in his eyes remained. "Solara, the Norek do not care about our titles, our traditions, or our bloodlines. They care only about one thing: victory, and Ethan Drake has shown time and again that he is capable of achieving it. His methods may be unconventional, but they work. And that is what matters." Solara felt her chest tighten as her father's words sank in. The Emperor had made his decision, and there was no room for argument. Ethan Drake, the human soldier, was to be their last hope. The council chamber was silent as everyone turned their eyes toward her, waiting for her reaction. Solara's mind raced, her thoughts clouded with doubt and uncertainty. Could this human truly be their salvation, or was her father's desperation clouding his judgment? Her heart sank as she thought of what was at stake. She had heard stories of Ethan Drake, tales of how he led ragtag human forces against overwhelming odds and managed to secure victories where no one thought it possible. But his methods were reckless. He didn't believe in honoring authority, and he certainly didn't respect the traditions of the Vaerithan Empire. How could a man like him lead an army of thousands? How could someone so different, so unrefined, stand side by side with the mighty Vaerithan forces? The room remained still as Solara's mind churned. She glanced at the faces around her, the council members, the generals, and the officers, none of them daring to question her father's decision. It was clear they all felt the same unease, but none would voice it. The Emperor's word was law, and they would follow him without question. As the meeting continued, Solara's thoughts remained fixed on the name of the human soldier, Ethan Drake. She had to meet him, to see for herself if he truly had the qualities her father believed him to possess, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Could a human really be their savior? And if he was, what would that mean for her, her role as the future ruler of the Vaerithan Empire? Would they all be forced to follow a human? When the council finally dismissed, Solara remained behind, staring out the large windows of the chamber. The stars outside, once a symbol of hope and possibility, now felt cold and distant. Her father had made his choice, and there was nothing she could do to change it. But she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She would meet this human, see what he was truly made of, and if he wasn't the leader the Vaerithan Empire needed, she would find another way. Princess Solara stood at the entrance to the Vaerithan military base, her eyes scanning the busy activity around her. Soldiers moved with precision, their armor gleaming in the light of the twin suns. The hum of shuttle engines filled the air, while technicians worked to maintain the fleet's weapons. Everything was as it should be. But there was an undeniable tension in the air, something that Solara couldn't ignore. She had been dreading this moment for days. Ethan Drake, the human her father had chosen to lead their forces, was supposed to arrive any moment. She had heard the rumors, of course. Stories about how Ethan had won impossible battles, with nothing but his wit and sheer willpower. But she didn't believe in legends. She believed in strategy, in discipline, in the centuries-old traditions of the Vaerithan Empire. As the shuttle landed in front of her, a gust of wind kicked up, swirling dust around her boots. The ramp lowered with a soft hiss, and Solara stood her ground, determined to meet this man who had caused such a stir. The figure that emerged from the shuttle was nothing like she had expected. Ethan Drake wasn't tall or imposing, at least not in the way Vaerithans were. He was a man of medium height, with short-cropped brown hair and eyes that seemed to flicker with an intensity that made Solara take an instinctive step back. His uniform was simple, no ornate decorations or shining armor, just a plain, worn combat suit. Like something a soldier would wear after weeks of fighting. He didn't look like a leader. He didn't look like the hero she had imagined. Ethan's gaze met hers for a moment. And then, without a word, he turned to one of the officers and began barking orders. His voice was firm, commanding, but not in the way of an aristocrat. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with titles or status. He was speaking to get things done. And from the way the officers immediately responded, it was clear that they understood him. Solara blinked, surprised by how effortlessly he took control of the situation. He wasn't waiting for permission. He wasn't making small talk. He was simply taking charge. "Your Highness," one of the officers stepped forward, bowing slightly. "This is General Drake. He will be overseeing the strategic operations for the defense." Solara forced herself to smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "General Drake," she said, her voice as neutral as she could make it. "I've heard much about you." Ethan turned to face her then, and for the first time, his full attention was on her. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting. He simply nodded. "Your Highness," he said, his voice low but clear. "I've heard of you too." Solara wasn't sure what to make of that. Was it a compliment? A statement of fact? She couldn't tell. But then, she wasn't sure she was ready to understand this man yet. Without another word, Ethan turned and began walking toward the command center, his pace quick and assured. He moved like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Solara stood there for a moment, watching him, then followed at a brisk pace. She had no choice. Her father had placed all their hopes in him, and she would have to work with him whether she liked it or not. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was tense. Maps and holographic projections of battle zones flickered on the walls, and officers and strategists moved about, giving reports and making calculations. Ethan didn't pause. He immediately took a seat at the center console, activating several screens with the press of a button. He studied the data without speaking, his face impassive. The room fell into an uneasy silence as everyone waited for him to say something. Solara stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Her father had asked her to observe, to see if this human general had the skill to save them. But watching Ethan in action made her feel uneasy. There was something about him, something sharp in his eyes, something ruthless in the way he worked that made her question if he was truly the leader they needed. After a few long minutes, Ethan finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. "We need to hit them before they strike," he said, his eyes scanning the holographic map. "The Norek are predictable. They move like a swarm fast, but always with a clear target in mind. If we can intercept their forces here," he pointed to a red zone on the map, "we can take out their supply lines and cripple their advance." The officers exchanged glances, murmuring in disagreement. "But General," one of the senior commanders said, "the Norek are vastly superior in numbers. A direct engagement could lead to catastrophic losses." Ethan turned his gaze toward the officer, his expression unchanging. "And doing nothing will lead to defeat. The Norek have no regard for our numbers or our strategies. They strike fast and without mercy. If we don't act, we'll be overrun." Solara felt a surge of respect for him, though she was reluctant to admit it. His confidence was undeniable, and it was clear that his mind was working at a speed that the others couldn't match. This wasn't just some wild-eyed soldier. Ethan Drake had a strategy, a plan. "What do you propose?" another officer asked, clearly frustrated with the lack of progress. Ethan's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll attack their weak point and make them think we're retreating. Once they move their forces in pursuit, we'll flank them and hit them where it hurts." He turned back to the map, focusing intently on the layout of the Norek's forces. Solara watched him, her curiosity growing. He wasn't giving orders from a place of arrogance, but from a place of experience. Every movement, every word, was calculated. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to consider the impossible. What if Ethan Drake was exactly what the Empire needed? The meeting continued, with Ethan outlining every detail of the plan. Solara stayed quiet, absorbing his words, watching him as he led with a steady hand. There was no doubt now this human soldier was different. He was a force in his own right. When the strategy was finally decided, Ethan stood up and motioned for the officers to begin preparations. "We move out in 2 hours," he said, his voice sharp. "Get your forces ready. We have no time to waste." Solara's mind was spinning as she watched him leave the command center. This was no ordinary soldier. This was someone who believed in action, in making things happen, not just talking about them. And that was something the Veyrithans, for all their power and tradition, had lost sight of. Outside, the sounds of preparations filled the air. Soldiers were assembling, shuttles were launching, and the tension was palpable. Solara stood there, watching everything unfold, trying to make sense of the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. She had seen Ethan's methods firsthand. She had witnessed his brilliance in action, but there was still one thing she wasn't sure about. Did he have what it took to lead them all? Not just in battle, but in the days ahead? As she turned to make her way back to her quarters, her thoughts were filled with the human soldier. Ethan Drake had already begun to change things, and the war was just beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of strategy sessions, drills, and near-constant preparation. The Veyrithan forces, once rigid and entrenched in their old ways, had begun to change. Ethan Drake's leadership was impossible to ignore. He didn't just command with authority. He led by example. His every move was deliberate, his every decision precise. The soldiers, both human and Vaerithan, had started to look up to him, to believe in him. In a way that made Solara uneasy. She couldn't deny the results. The first skirmishes between the Vaerithans and the Norek had been disastrous for the enemy. Ethan's tactics, though unconventional, had proven their worth. The Norek had never expected such unpredictable warfare, and as their forces struggled to adapt, the Vaerithans began to take back lost ground. Every victory, every small success, brought a renewed sense of hope to the people of the Empire. And yet, Solara remained conflicted. She had spent countless hours observing Ethan, his methods, his decisions, his interactions with the soldiers. In battle, he was fearless. But when the fighting was over, when the dust settled, she saw something in him that she couldn't quite place. There was a hardness in his eyes, a coldness that worried her. He wasn't like the Vaerithans, who relied on honor and tradition. He didn't fight for glory or status. He fought because it was what needed to be done, and nothing more. That, in itself, was admirable, but it also made Solara wonder if he truly understood the weight of the empire he was now leading. The Vaerithan aristocracy, for their part, were less than thrilled by Ethan's rise to power. Solara had overheard whispered conversations in the palace corridors, discussions about his lack of respect for their traditions, his refusal to acknowledge the importance of their ancient ways. They had never believed in the idea of a human leading them. To many, it felt like an insult, a disgrace. But her father, Emperor Talon, had supported the decision. He had placed his faith in Ethan, just as he had once placed his faith in her. And so, Solara found herself at a crossroads. Her father had always been a steady hand, guiding the empire through turbulent times with wisdom and tact. He had shaped the Vaerithan Empire into one of the most powerful in the galaxy. But in his old age, he had begun to show signs of uncertainty, of doubt. His faith in Ethan, though strong, was not shared by everyone. Some within the Empire's leadership began to question the Emperor's judgment, asking if a human, someone from a species so young, so unrefined, could truly lead them to victory. At times, Solara thought that the growing tension was more dangerous than the Norek themselves. The divisions within the Empire were beginning to show. If the aristocracy refused to accept Ethan's leadership, if they openly rebelled, what would happen? What would the people think? Would they follow the will of their emperor? Or would they side with those who opposed the human? She could feel the pressure building with every passing day. One evening, after a long day of strategy meetings and military drills, Solara found herself in the palace's private gardens. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the suffocating tension of the war room. She walked along the familiar path, the sound of her footsteps soft against the stone. The stars above were a clear, brilliant canvas, shining down on the empire she had been born to rule. Yet, despite the beauty of the night, she felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. She had made a decision. She needed to talk to Ethan, to understand him better. If her father's plan was going to succeed, if the empire was going to survive, Solara needed to know if Ethan was truly capable of leading them not just in battle, but in the long months and years to come. She found him in the training yard, long after most of the soldiers had gone to rest. He was alone, sharpening his blade under the pale moonlight. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he worked, as if every stroke of the blade was a meditation of sorts. His focus was absolute. Solara hesitated for a moment, watching him, unsure of how to approach. But eventually, she stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "General Drake." Ethan looked up, his face unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak, just studied her as if weighing her presence against the weight of the night. Then, he nodded in recognition. "Princess Solara," he said, his voice low, though there was no trace of surprise. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. "No, I wanted to speak with you." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he finished sharpening his blade, placing it carefully in the sheath at his side. Then, he turned to face her fully. What about? I need to understand something, Solara said, her voice steady. I need to know if you're doing this for the right reasons. If you're truly prepared to lead not just in battle, but in the future of this empire. Ethan's eyes flickered, but his expression remained unchanged. He crossed his arms, looking at her intently. The empire? I'm not here to rule it, princess. I'm here to win this war. Solara felt a pang of frustration. But winning the war won't be enough. If we defeat the Norek, what happens then? Will we just return to the way things were before? What will happen to the Vaerithan people, to the empire, when the dust settles and the battles are over? Ethan's gaze softened, but his answer was blunt. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm a soldier. Her heart clenched. That's not good enough. I can't be the one to carry the weight of the empire alone. My father, he's already starting to step back. I can feel it. If you're going to lead, you need to understand the consequences of your actions. This isn't just about strategy. It's about the future of everything we've built. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I know what it's like to fight for survival. To keep going, even when it seems like everything is lost. That's all I've ever done. But I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't come here to be your savior, princess. I'm here because I'm good at what I do. If that helps you, then fine. But don't expect me to suddenly start caring about the politics of an empire I don't belong to. Solara felt a strange mix of anger and sympathy. She had never expected him to be easy to understand. But she had hoped for something more. She had hoped that he would see the empire, her people, the weight of it all. Instead, he was focused only on the immediate war on victory, and nothing beyond that. For the first time, Solara wondered if Ethan Drake was the right person for the job after all. Could she trust him with the future of her people? Was his pragmatism a strength? Or was it a weakness that could tear them all apart? I didn't want you to be a hero, Solara said, her voice low. I just wanted you to be someone who understands what this empire needs. Ethan didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving Solara standing alone in the moonlight. As she watched him disappear into the shadows, the uncertainty in her heart only grew. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. But the question remained. Was this the right choice? The days leading up to the battle felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. As the Norek prepared for their final assault on the Vaerithan capital, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut through with a blade. Every soldier, every officer, every civilian, everyone knew what was at stake. The survival of the empire rested on the edge of a knife, and the man holding it was none other than Ethan Drake. Princess Solara had spent sleepless nights walking the palace halls, trying to make sense of everything. She had always known that leadership meant sacrifice. She had been trained for it her whole life. But this was something different. Ethan Drake was not like the leaders she had studied or the heroes of her people's history. He wasn't motivated by honor, glory, or tradition. He was driven by something else, a cold, calculating desire to win, no matter the cost. And yet, it was that very thing that made him the right man for the job. The Norek were unlike any enemy the Vaerithans had ever faced. They were ruthless, efficient, and relentless. They didn't believe in mercy. They didn't care about the lives they destroyed along the way. They fought for one purpose: domination. And as the Vaerithans watched their capital city prepare for the final battle, they all knew that their only chance for survival was to outsmart them. That's where Ethan came in. Solara had watched him carefully over the past few weeks, studying him as he had led the Vaerithan forces. He wasn't perfect, he was brash, stubborn, and had no patience for politics. But he had a gift, a mind capable of seeing the battlefield in ways no one else could. He had devised a plan that might, just might, give them the edge they needed to survive. The plan was simple: lure the Norek into a trap. The Norek expected a head-on confrontation. They were coming in full force, ready to destroy the capital. Ethan knew this, and so, instead of facing them head-on, he'd set a series of decoy positions, tricking the Norek into spreading their forces thin. While they chased down the false targets, the real Verithan army would strike at the heart of the Norek command. It was a gamble. If the Norek realized what was happening, if they adapted too quickly, the entire Verithan fleet would be wiped out. But if it worked, it would cripple the Norek's command structure and give them a fighting chance. Solara stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out at the fleet below. The ships were ready, gleaming, powerful, and waiting for the signal. The ground troops, stationed in the city's outskirts, had prepared as best they could, but the Verithans were at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. It all came down to strategy, and strategy, it seemed, was where Ethan Drake excelled. Ethan's plan wasn't popular with everyone. The Verithan High Command, especially the older generals, didn't like the idea of relying on deception rather than direct confrontation. They believed that the Verithans, with their advanced technology and superior weaponry, should fight the Norek in open battle. But Ethan had made it clear fighting the Norek on their terms would be suicide. Solara had watched the tension grow within the council meetings. There were whispers, even among the soldiers, questioning whether Ethan was truly the right choice. Some of them were still resentful of the fact that a human, of all people, was in charge. But Solara had seen the results. The battles they had fought under his leadership had been brutal. But they had won. The soldiers respected him. They trusted him, and most importantly, they believed in him. When the time came, the call went out across the fleet. The Verithan ships began their silent, coordinated movements, slipping into the shadow of the distant moon. The Norek were still advancing, unaware of the trap they were walking into. The decoy forces, placed strategically across the system, would serve to lure them into a false sense of security. As soon as the Norek took the bait, the real strike would come. Solara stood by Ethan's side as the final preparations were made. She hadn't spoken to him in days, not since their conversation in the garden. She had been so torn about his leadership, so uncertain about his true intentions. But now, standing beside him, seeing the determination in his eyes, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't here for glory. He was here because he believed in winning. He believed in saving lives, even if he couldn't bring himself to care about the politics of the Verithan Empire. He cared about the people he was protecting. "Are you ready for this?" Solara asked quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan didn't look at her. His eyes were focused on the holographic displays in front of him, watching the movements of the Norek fleet. "I'm ready. But they're not the ones we need to worry about." Solara raised an eyebrow. "Who do we need to worry about then?" "The people who want me to fail," Ethan said, his voice laced with quiet certainty. "If we win, they'll accept me as their leader. But if we lose, I'll be the scapegoat." Solara was silent for a long moment. She had never considered that. Ethan had been leading them in battle, winning every skirmish, outsmarting the Norek at every turn. But she had never thought about the consequences of failure for him, how his enemies in the Empire might use that against him. It was a sobering thought. The fleet began to move into position, and the first decoy positions were activated. The Norek were starting to take the bait. Their ships, sleek and menacing, began to split off, chasing down the false targets. The trap was working, but Solara couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something wasn't right, and then it hit her. "The Norek," she murmured, her mind racing. "They've fallen for it. They're splitting their forces. But they're not retreating. They're going straight for the heart of the trap." Ethan's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time, she saw the faintest flicker of doubt in his gaze. "What are you suggesting?" "We've underestimated them," she said. "They're too smart. They're using the decoy to their advantage, drawing us out. If we don't act fast, they'll regroup and destroy our main fleet." Ethan didn't hesitate. His fingers flew over the controls, rerouting ships, calling in reinforcements, changing their strategy on the fly. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice low and determined. Within minutes, the situation shifted. The Verithan fleet, though scattered, was able to regroup just in time to strike at the Noreks' vulnerable flank. The battle that followed was a brutal, heart-pounding fight, with ships falling on both sides. But Ethan's quick thinking and decisive action turned the tide. In the end, it was the Norek commander who fell. With his death, their forces collapsed, and the remaining Norek ships retreated, leaving the Vaerethans victorious. The victory didn't come without a cost. The capital was heavily damaged, and many lives were lost. But the Vaerethan Empire had survived. And with it, a new future was born. One where humans and Vaerethans stood side by side, not as separate races, but as allies. As the smoke cleared and the survivors began to regroup, Solara found herself standing beside Ethan once more. His face was streaked with grime, his uniform torn, but there was a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "Yeah, we did." In that moment, Solara knew that everything had changed. The future of the Vaerethan Empire, her people, and even the humans was now inextricably tied to Ethan Drake. Whether she liked it or not, the human soldier had proven himself to be their true leader. The battle was over. But the war for the future of the galaxy was just beginning.